I think societies tend to develop quite a rigid set of ideas about their cultural heritage, the traditions, the building blocks that make up the foundations of collective knowledge. In the West, I think we try to draw a kind of through line of an imagined cultural inheritance from the ancient Egyptians through to the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and then perhaps the Italian Renaissance. And we get taught this set, quite inflexible version of history, and it informs the way we think about the world going forward. And this matters. You can see just how attached people are to what they see as their cultural heritage, their imagined cultural heritage, through all the opinion pieces and podcasts about Western civilization apparently being under attack from within and without. But I wonder what we are missing from such a simplified through line. What if there's a whole aspect of our cultural inheritance that is simply missing? What if we need to have a much more flexible approach to how we consider and relate to the past? My colleague Lydia Wilson, New Lines' cultural editor, recently brought the historian Selena Wisnom onto the podcast to discuss exactly that. Selena is a lecturer in the heritage of the Middle East at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, and she's just brought out a new book called The Library of Ancient Wisdom. Lydia, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So what is this Library of Ancient Wisdom, and why did you think that you needed to bring Selena on to talk about it?
Well, the library refers to the personal library of the Assyrian King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in Nineveh in the 7th century BCE. And it's this incredible resource as a result of a terrible event, because the whole palace was burnt to the ground by a rival during some regional wars. But this actually baked the tablets, which helped preserve them extremely well until today. And because Ashurbanipal in particular, but in fact most Mesopotamian kings, were all dedicated to scholarship, the library is this massive repository of ancient knowledge. He collected tablets and sources from all over his vast empire. And really, it should be thought of as foundational to our culture, but for reasons I discuss with Selena in the podcast, it tends to be completely glossed over.
So, what are some of these ways that we've brushed over Mesopotamian history?
Yeah, there's a lot, but probably the best example is how we credit the invention of written language to the ancient Egyptians when actually the earliest evidence of writing is from Mesopotamia. And it's a good couple of centuries before the earliest forms of the Egyptian hieroglyphs that have ever been found. And that's despite the fact we have all these hundreds and thousands of sources, because clay survives so much better than papyrus. But as Selena says, cuneiform just doesn't look as sexy. It's these weird geometric repetitive lines on clay tablets. So it just doesn't stick in our mind in the same way as the pictorial, beautiful Egyptian hieroglyphs.
When you had this conversation with Selena, did it turn up anything as to why this topic is so important? I mean, from a purely historical point of view.
Oh, yeah, there's this really interesting section in the episode where we talk about how these Mesopotamian cultures are at once familiar and unfamiliar. And that speaks to a really important wider discussion about how we relate to history and these stories that we choose to tell from thousands of years ago. And Selena makes the fascinating point that many of the things we consider completely irrational of what she's studied, like divining the future from the liver of a sheep or in the stars or a stray dog crossing your path, are they really all that different from a lot of the things we do today, like polling for elections or economic forecasting, both of which have rather similar success rates to looking at a sheep's liver? So I think it helps us to situate ourselves in the present moment.
Well, it sounds very interesting. Sounds like a good episode. Here is this week's episode of The Lead.
Selena Wisnom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, Mesopotamia is often thought of, I think, in the same way as ancient Egypt. I mean, these two huge empires at either end of the Fertile Crescent, dominating the region for thousands of years. And indeed, they have a roughly similar timeline, don't they? Or at least they overlap by a good 3 millennia. But ancient Egypt is familiar to, I think, most school children, certainly across the West, whereas Mesopotamian culture simply hasn't had the same attention paid to it. It's just not in the general cultural consciousness, despite being as foundational as ancient Egypt in world history. Why is that, do you think?
You're absolutely right. And I think it's because so much more colour survives from Egypt, actually. And I think we're often very visual beings, and it's impossible to fail to be impressed by what we see from Egypt just because of the style of their art. But actually the writing that survives from Mesopotamia is absolutely astonishing once you find out what they have written down and what their culture has bequeathed to us. Maybe not so exciting to look at because they wrote on clay tablets. So these are, they're writing on mud, basically. But the fact that they wrote on mud is actually an amazing boon to us because these clay tablets survive. They don't decay in the ground like papyrus does, or animal parchment. And if you burn down a library full of clay tablets, then the fire actually bakes the clay and helps to preserve it even better. So we have probably about 500,000 sources from Mesopotamia as a whole, and it preserves such an amazing range of information about what these people were like, the kinds of stories they told, the way they thought about the world, which is something that hardly anybody knows about, but once you get into it, it's just absolutely fascinating.
So less colourful, but far more of it. So without the attention that Egypt has got, what have we kind of let slip out of our grasp? What have we forgotten?
Well, Mesopotamia has left so many signs in our culture, actually. Every time we look at a clock to tell the time, we're dividing time by 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. That's a Mesopotamian counting system, for instance. The Mesopotamians invented mathematical astronomy, and that comes down to us via the Greeks. They even invented the concept of mathematical algorithms during that process. The very idea that you can even extrapolate trends from data. Also, they were the first ones to do that and to write it down. So there are actually a lot of things which are really quite foundational to our culture that come from there, quite apart from all the amazing stories that they told, which are also circulating all over the Near East and probably went on to influence Greek literature, Roman literature and religion even, which have come down to us that way. So they're a few steps removed, but actually when you trace it back, there's a lot that we have to thank them for.
Well, and also you mentioned the very close correlation between Mesopotamian stories and a lot of the Jewish Christian canon, the Jewish stories that make up the Christian Old Testament. I think probably the most famous of that is Noah and his ark. You've got a wonderful quote of the scholar who first noticed this, who first deciphered the tablet with this story of a ship resting on a mountaintop and sending out a dove to look for dry land, so similar to our more familiar Noah and his ark. And you say he was so excited he stripped off all his clothes and ran around the British Museum? Is that right?
Well, apparently the story goes that when he read this, he exclaimed, "I am the first man to read this after 2,000 years of oblivion," and then started undressing himself and running around the study room. Which it was a story that's recorded by one of the curators at the museum at the time, but one who apparently really didn't like him. So whether or not it's true, we don't know. But it's still a great story because it encapsulates how exciting it is to read cuneiform, both then and now.
But you said earlier that there are 500,000 of these clay tablets, and only a tiny fraction has so far been transcribed, translated. So do you have that same feeling? Do all scholars of Mesopotamian culture, you're all reading it for the first time in 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years, right?
Yes, exactly. We're still dealing with the backlog of the 19th century when the bulk of this stuff was discovered. There are excavations going on in Iraq right now, so there are new tablets coming out of the ground also, which is another extraordinary thing and not something that's found in all fields of ancient history, right? The constant appearance of new sources. And yeah, there are things sitting around in museums that have been neglected or people might have read once or twice but haven't actually done anything with, or even have never been read at all. And that's another thing that makes this field so exciting to work in.
Can you give a sense? I know it's so hard when things are still in the ground, but can you give a sense of what is still left to decipher? Are there many more of these overlaps waiting to be found, do you think?
Oh, well, we just don't know. I mean, one of the recent discoveries, a couple of years ago, they found the library of a diviner in Nineveh, which is the city where the library that I've written about was located. So we're still awaiting publication details for that. But, I'd love to know, what are the texts that a diviner has in his personal collection? Like, what is he reading? That's an example of something really exciting that soon we'll be able to know.
And just happened. I mean, just before we get on to the details of all of that, these excavations are happening in Iraq, modern-day Mesopotamia, and we know that there's an awful lot of looting, which had a big spike after the invasion of 2003. Do you worry about what's being lost as well as what's being found?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The terrible thing about looting is that you don't even know what's lost. The looting of museums is terrible and is one thing, but at least we more or less know what's in the museums.
Right.
But when it comes out of the ground, you just don't know what you've lost. So that is a terrible thing. But at the same time, I think we hear so much bad news about Iraq. We hear about the constant troubles, the wars, the looting, and so on. But it's easy to get the impression from that there isn't so much that can be done. But we have so much, and there's so much we can do with what we already have and what is being found now. Yeah. And that's something I think people don't necessarily appreciate. There's so much more that we can do with what we already have.
And coming out all the time.
Yeah.
Well, let's back up a bit and actually explain a little bit more about Mesopotamia itself. When there are so many different languages being used, not to mention all the dynasties and empires coming and going over this time, I mean, Sumerian and Akkadian, the two main languages of the area, aren't even part of the same language family, are they?
No.
So how can we speak of Mesopotamia this way? Is it geography alone, the two rivers in its name, or are there other unifying features?
Well, that's an excellent question because, of course, there were so many different people who lived in this area. But I think one thing that does bind them together is the use of cuneiform writing. The Sumerians are the ones who invent writing for the first time in history in southern Iraq at the very end of the 4th millennium BC, just to give a sense of this incredible time span. And people are still writing in cuneiform in the 1st century AD. So more than 3,000 years later. The very last dated tablet we have is from 80 AD, written in Babylon, a series of astronomical observations. So even though, lots of different people are there, and cuneiform writing is also adapted to write other languages in the Near East as well. They invent a cuneiform-inspired alphabet in Ugarit in Syria. The Persian king Darius also orders his scholars to invent an alphabet, writing system rather than alphabet, based on cuneiform to write Old Persian. I mean, Iran is not quite what we consider Mesopotamia, but it just shows the incredible reach of Mesopotamian culture as well, and the prestige and influence of cuneiform. For 3,000 years, it has a very dominant influence on the whole region, really.
And it's so distinctive, isn't it? There's no other writing system that uses those very detailed, clear wedges.
Yeah, and the fact that it's a syllable, sound-based script means it can be adapted to write these different languages. So it starts out pictographic in origin. So you're drawing pictures of the things that you want to write, but then they take the sounds of those pictures and use those to represent syllables in words. Yeah. So to take an example, the Sumerian word for head is sang, and you would use that if you want to indicate, a ration that you're giving to a person, like a little head and a little bowl. Draw it out. But if you want to write a word like hero, which is urasang in Sumerian, then you would still draw the little head for that syllable sang. And that's what really opens it up and makes it incredibly flexible. And then you can take those sounds and use them to write sounds in any language that you want.
Well, we're going to come back to the nature of cuneiform and the complexity and the reason for adopting it. You mentioned Darius, but people all for thousands of years adopted the system. But just before we move on, while we're on the subject of definitions still, can you explain why the academic discipline is called Assyriology?
Yes, well, Assyriology is a very, very broad term. it can be used to describe people who study anything from the invention of Sumerian writing, accounting, and bureaucracy and literature, right up until Babylonian mathematics, astronomy, medicine.
But the Assyrians
were the first people who were discovered. So in the 19th century, when excavations started in the Middle East, the first things they found were the palaces of the Assyrian kings. So that's why people started to call the discipline Assyriology. But of course, then they kept digging. So suddenly they find, the Assyrians are actually, they're closer to the top of the archaeological layers. As you go down, you find older and older and older peoples, civilizations. They find there's old Assyrians, middle Assyrians, as well as new Assyrians. Then they go further south and they find there's also the Babylonians. They dig further back in time and then they find the Sumerians. But by that time, the name Assyriology had kind of stuck. So it's a name of convenience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you mind?
I don't mind. I like the Assyrians, so it's fine by me.
Well, let's turn to some specific examples. I mean, your book uses one single collection of texts, albeit an admittedly huge one, to tell a much broader story of the region through time and space. And the reason this is possible is because of their attitude to history, right?
Yes.
The text preserved is such a dedicated task of collecting huge amounts of texts when Ashurbanipal was on the throne and building his library. The back catalogue of what a collection should contain at that time was vast. So a study of this single collection reaches incredibly far back, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it. The Mesopotamians in general have a really profound respect for tradition. They copy things very faithfully. Even on the tablets when they're copying, they will say this is copied and checked according to original, which I found in Babylon, for instance. If the tablet they are copying is broken and they don't have all of the signs, they will actually indicate where it's broken. That's how much attention to detail they pay to this. And they are still reading texts in the time of this library 1,000 years that originate 1,000 years before the time of the library. And they even talk about that. There's a letter to the king where the scholar says that he will fetch a tablet from the time of King Hammurabi, who ruled in the 18th century BC, 1,000 years before. And a lot of the knowledge also originated around that time in the second millennium BC. Many of these texts were written down for the first time then and had been treasured and updated also, and also copied faithfully. They do both things. They preserve tradition and they innovate with it, but they have a very strong sense of where it comes from always.
Well, in that sense of scholarship that they're referencing, it's like academic scholarship now, giving your sources. So they're telling us, aren't they, the difference between where they're innovating and where they're preserving. Is that right?
More or less, yeah. So they don't reference maybe as precisely as we do, but when it is an original, they definitely tell us that. Yes, and they also tell us when they are re-editing text. And this is something that happens as well. In Ashurbanipal, who assembled this library, he tells us that there's a particular group of plants used in medicine, which has become a bit of a mess. They've got all of these traditions from all over the place, and some of them are overlapping, and he wants to produce a definitive edition of it, and he commissions his scholars to do that. And he tells us that this is something that he's made a priority, which is also a sort of very modern scholarly activity, editing texts.
Editing and compiling and bringing together. And I know we can't ever read intention into the past, but why do you think they had this very respectful attitude to their own traditions? Why were they preserving history so assiduously?
Oh, why are they preserving history so assiduously? I think for them, ancientness is equated with authority. The older something is, the more likely it is to be true. And this also tallies with their own origin stories of how they got this knowledge. So there are stories about how there was a fish-headed god who came out of the sea to give humans the arts of writing and civilization. So the idea that if something is very ancient, it's more likely to have come from that direct line of transmission, which is ultimately from the gods. So there are also texts in the library that we call a kind of quote-unquote library catalogue which lists authors, and it ascribes many of the texts in this library as having been written by the gods. So if you think of the text as being written by the gods, then of course it's important to preserve the words and to get it right.
And to go back to the source.
Yeah.
And do we have any sense, this is a bit of a sideline, do we have any sense why he was a fish man? Were fish particularly honoured in the tradition?
Oh, well, I think it's connected with water as being a realm of wisdom. So the god of wisdom, magic, and general cunning and inventiveness, actually, was the god Ea. And Ea was thought to rule over the Apsu, which is a name for the groundwater, the source of all of the rivers. So, yeah, fish are sort of connected with rivers, connected with Ea and his general domain of wisdom.
And it doesn't just apply to text, does it, this respect for the past? The work they did on old buildings as well reflects the same sort of attitude, which I'm not sure if that's related to the gods or not. But your colleague Moody al-Rashid has just published a recent book, Between Two Rivers, on the respect for ancient objects rather than texts, including the foundation stones, bricks of buildings that are imprinted with past rulers' names. And so, there's clearly a work of preservation going on there. And you can also see it not just in the objects that they're preserving, but in the way they're rebuilding a lot of these monumental buildings. The ziggurat at Ur was rebuilt many times. Now, for them, that was a work, as I understand it, of honouring the past. But when people in the present try and do that, and I'm thinking of Saddam Hussein, who went back to Mesopotamian buildings, rebuilt them, scratched his own name on them, he was vilified for his narcissism. But in a very real way, he was following the footsteps of his predecessors, right?
Yes, absolutely. He was doing the same as them. What's great is that the Mesopotamians they left these time capsules, really. Every time they renovated a temple, they would inscribe a cylinder object saying what they'd done and put it in the ground, and they expected future rulers to find them. And we know that because in some of these inscriptions, they talk about how when they were digging the foundations to renovate the temple, they found the inscriptions of rulers who came before them. And again, huge time spans. I mean, some of them 1,500 years or more before the time of the rulers themselves. So they expected their words to last. They are leaving messages directly to the future. And as for the temples being located in the same place, I think that is also a respect for tradition, right? They don't tend to go around building new temples that much. They renovate the ones that already exist. And the sites of temples are very ancient. They're usually in the center of the city or somewhere very, very prominent where they would be seen by people, a very prominent position, very visible. And so that's also saying something about respect for original locations and keeping things the way they are.
And a sense of tradition again. Seeing yourself in a chain, really.
Yeah.
Now, I know this is very, very difficult question, but the whole focus of your book, the library, Ashurbanipal's library, can you give a sense of the subjects it contains?
Yes. So it's Ashurbanipal's personal collection in some way. I think that's important to understand. And so it reflects what he's interested in. And what he's interested in is the business of ruling an empire. So there are more texts in this library than anything else on the subject of divination, because that's an incredibly important tool for ruling. If you want to find out what's happening, if you want help from the gods to decide what to do, then all of the arts of divination are going to be incredibly helpful, as the Assyrians think, for doing that. So many different branches. There's astrology, which is invented by the Mesopotamians, and many things in the astrology that is still hanging around for us today comes directly from them. There is divination from sacrificing sheep. If they want to know the answer to any question, then they ask the gods. They believe the gods will write the answers on the entrails of the sheep. They open them up and they have a complex system for reading that, getting the answers to questions. But they also can tell the future from unusual things that just happen in the world around them. So, for instance, if a lizard falls on your left shoulder, this is going to mean something. If you pass a white cat in the street, that's a bad omen. White cats rather than black cats you've got to worry about in Assyria. If a dog comes into your house, if fungus is growing in the corner of your bedroom wall, all of these sorts of things can have an impact. So the library's got a lot of text of that kind. But that's not the only kind, of course. There's a lot of literature in it. I think it's one of our best sources for pretty much all kinds of Mesopotamian culture. Ashurbanipal has got more copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh than anybody else, for instance, which is one of the most famous and most important of all Babylonian poems. It's got rituals in it. There's a lot of magic, a lot of incantations, which is also helpful in terms of ruling the empire because it's all about getting the gods on side. But he's also interested just in pure academics as well, I think. So, that's why we've got Sumerian literature in there. That's why there are so many medical texts in there. He copies out during his own education a technical glass-making recipe, which is a pretty obscure thing. Most Assyriologists haven't even read any text like that themselves. I mean, I actually haven't. So I think he does what he's telling us that he's doing. He's collecting all sorts of things in this library, and a lot of it is useful, and a lot of it is also he's collecting all of the great traditions of Mesopotamia, and it goes back as far as he can to find them.
So let me just pick up on that idea that it's his personal choice, because as I read your book, I really got the impression he was trying to be encyclopedic. He was trying to really grasp what his whole tradition had contained, that he was sending people out to copy tablets from all over his empire, really. What's the link with encyclopedic knowledge, do you think? Do you think
I think they're both true. If that's not too much of a contradiction, because, if you look at the libraries that belong to temples, for instance, we have got some temple collections from Babylonia, and they don't contain the same number of omens as we have in Ashurbanipal's library. Yes, they also have these texts, but the proportion is different. So that's why I think it's that aspect of it is influenced by Ashurbanipal's interests and what might be useful to the Assyrian Empire. But yeah, he does also send people out to just get whatever he can. So when he conquered Babylon, for instance, he confiscated the libraries of scholars after the city was defeated and added them to his collection. We've also got letters that describe how he wrote to scholars in different cities and asked them to send the tablets that they had, send them to him. And there's one obscure one he asks for, which one of the cities he sends to say, we don't have it. The only place you can get it is the Temple of Marduk in Babylon. So he is asking for rare stuff as well. And that does also add to this sense of the encyclopedic knowledge, getting his hands on as much as he can.
So I'd really like to explore something that I've been struggling with, and I know you must have done too. And there are basically two poles that everyone's trying to navigate between. You kind of reference it in the book. When you're reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, you say, and I quote, "I was struck by the familiarity of its themes and the strangeness with which they were expressed." But also, shortly after, you write, "It is the strangeness of Mesopotamia that draws me to it." So, is this a world that is fundamentally familiar or fundamentally unfamiliar?
Well, my answer is going to be both at once, of course, but in different ways, right? And I think it's actually that combination which is such a hook. Yes, there are things about it that we can immediately identify with, but the fact that we can't identify with all of it is what makes it so intriguing. And I think really one of the things I wanted to do with the book is to try to make it as familiar as possible. So there's lots that does strike us as fundamentally weird about Babylonian culture. One of them being that if you want to know the answer to a question, you might rummage around inside a sheep to find out the answer. This seems totally baffling to us. But, on the other hand, when we try to get into their mindset and think about, why are they doing this and how are they doing it and what kind of logic are they using, I think it makes a lot more sense than we might think. When we really want to know the answer to a question, if we're uncertain about what the future holds, what's going on in the world, we might be refreshing the news every 30 seconds. Is that any more rational? I don't know, really. And we have our own ways of trying to divine the future, which are similar in some ways. We will construct economic models, for instance. We're collecting data and we're trying to predict what's going to happen based on that. Now, obviously, our data, it comes from the real world, not from inside a sheep. But we're doing something that's fundamentally similar in a way. Election predicting, for instance, when we're desperate to know who's going to win a political contest, we commission opinion polls. These are vast and expensive undertakings. They also require a lot of data collection, a lot of complicated systems, models. But how accurate are they in the end? They're not always. Yeah. They're not always right either. So we have the same impulse, is what I'm saying, really. We all hate uncertainty and are doing whatever we can to eliminate that, to gain some certainty, to try to see what's going on. And although our methods, very often are more accurate than the Babylonians, they're not always, actually.
Not always, not always. That's something that sounds familiar. You've made the case there for familiarity. One of the things that struck me as very unfamiliar, and especially speaking as a writer and somebody who's explored the history of writing, is cuneiform itself. The whole system, the attitude to writing and the attitude of communicating knowledge. Because with our alphabet, I think we've really learned to assume that efficiency, clarity, simplicity is best. And I think we assume that with our writing as well, that simplicity and clarity are things to strive for. But you've written about how their complexity was actively celebrated and developed. Why were they so keen on complexity, do you think? Why the difference with our own emphasis on simplicity?
Well, it gives them options, I think. And it also enriches the scope of what they are doing. So fundamentally, cuneiform signs can have different values. That's at the heart of this. So one sign can be read lots of different ways. And ultimately, you only know which one it is from the context. So if I'm reading a cuneiform text, I will have all of the different signs spinning around in my head, a bit like playing with a slot machine, right? You've got different values spinning around until they all click into a word. That makes sense. But there's different ways of spelling words as well as this, right? So they've got choices about which signs to use to spell out words. And that allows for a different kind of individuality in these texts as well. The fact that you could spell something a simple way or an incredibly complicated way tells you something about that person. It means you can also enrich the text with extra meanings. So puns are really important in Mesopotamian culture. So the fact that two signs either sound the same or look the same, to them it means that they are fundamentally connected, that the concepts they represent are fundamentally connected. And they like to play around with that. And this opens up a whole other aspect in the literary interpretation of these texts as well, because you can get puns that are made in writing, which you can't necessarily see or appreciate if you're hearing the text. When you see it, it gives a whole other level to it, which is something that I absolutely love.
But you push that further in your book, that section on puns, I think, that for them, it's not just wordplay or an expression of individuality. You said something about it uncovering the nature of the world, that there's a link here between writing and reality that I think probably we've lost. Am I right about that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, for them, these connections in language, it's how the fabric of the universe is structured. And you can follow these chains of association. This sign looks like that sign. That sign sounds like that sign. That other sign is read this other way. And that's why this omen means that this thing will happen, even. So that's what I mean about how language is giving structure to the universe.
So does that mean if you develop your writing, develop new characters, you are affecting reality or discovering reality?
I think they see it in the sense of discovering reality. And I mean, there's another whole genre of text in the library, which is commentaries on some of these obscure scholarly texts, where that's where they really explore this. They will quote little bits of text and say, oh, this sign sounds similar to that sign, and that's why this. So yeah, for them, it's a process of discovery to really think about all of these chains of connection in their own language.
Well, let's kind of explore that then, that kind of difference between familiarity and unfamiliarity. So you write in the book, and I quote, "Mesopotamia's history is significant not just for Ashurbanipal or the Middle East, but for the whole world, as Mesopotamia witnessed numerous developments that have influenced us all in profound and often surprising ways, earning it the title of the cradle of civilization." So let's go into that then. What are the profound and surprising ways you were meaning?
Well, the very invention of writing itself. These are the first people to invent the concept of writing, full stop. They were the first people to live in cities on a sort of massive scale. We find in Mesopotamia the first attested versions of banking, law, mathematics. It's the fact that all of these things happen so early on in world history, and they happen there. And then it all spins out. They influence peoples around them influence other peoples around them, and so on and so on and so on, if you're tracing it right back to the start.
So I know we never should do counterfactuals or anything like that, but how tangibly different would that have been? I mean, we talk about the 60-second clock, and I know Mesopotamians had base 60, and that's where that comes from. But it was based on a physical reality, which is that 6 locks of 60 are essentially the nearest approximation to how many days there are in a year. It's based on an actual observation. And surely we would have had cities and laws without the Mesopotamian example. So some of these things, I suppose I'm asking, how specific are they to the Mesopotamian culture?
Well, it's true that other civilizations have come up with those concepts on their own. It's true. But I think Mesopotamia has influenced the classical tradition quite a lot, and the classical tradition has influenced us hugely, even if we're not as aware of it now as we once were. So, a lot of things in Greek and Roman religion, Greek and Roman philosophy actually have connections with what's happening in Mesopotamia. Diogenes the Stoic was actually born very close to Babylon, for example. So there's a lot more going on in the realm of philosophy than most of us are aware of. So I guess there is a more direct link to us through how Mesopotamia influenced classical thinkers. And that's one of the main routes of transmission to us today.
And they knew about it. We might have forgotten that, but you make the point in your book. Do you finish like this, in fact, that Alexander the Great was clearly so affected by all of the things you've been talking about, the omens, the divination, the signs, the prophecies. He was clearly living inside that tradition, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Alexander the Great made full use of the expertise of the Babylonian scholars when he was there.
It didn't work out so well for him, I might say.
Sadly not. No, they tried to use the ancient ritual of the substitute king to save him when he was dying. So this is a very old Mesopotamian tradition where usually if there's an eclipse, that means the king is going to die, then the king goes into hiding for 100 days, sits by the riverbank, and they call him the farmer and pretend that he's not really the king while they put somebody else on the throne. That person who's on the throne, they get to behave like the king, they can have as much wine as they want, they get to have a good time, but at the end of 100 days they are put to death, and so thus the prophecy is fulfilled. The king has died, but the actual king is still safe and he can come back and take the throne. So the Babylonian scholars tried to use that when Alexander was dying in Babylon, which I think is amazing that they offered that to him, actually, one of their most important traditions. And it's something that is attested a very, very long time before Alexander, a long time even before the time of the library. So it's one of the longest lived of all Mesopotamian traditions.
Well, and the influence is clear. But what do you think the geographical boundaries are of this influence? You write on the one hand that their heritage is a world heritage whose influence has left its mark across the globe. But also you write, from the Middle East to the West, more than half of human history is written in cuneiform. And that's an astonishing fact, but it might not be of so much interest to a listener in China, for example, where so much of modern culture and technology is being created now. What do you think the geographical limits of the influence of Mesopotamian culture was?
Well, China does, of course, have its own very, very ancient traditions. But cuneiform knowledge did make it quite far east as well. And this was one of the things that surprised me when I was researching this book, actually, is that the astronomical knowledge made it at least as far as India, even further into Central Asia. We have examples of Mesopotamian style omens there, and also the formulas that they use to write letters make it as far as Central Asia. It's possible that it could have been carried even further from Central Asia into China. This is a very, very controversial area, which I think, needs more research before anything definitive can be said about it. But there are some similarities in the ways that Chinese astrology on behalf of the state is practiced and the way that it was in Babylon. Whether those arose independently or whether there was a transmission link is an open question, but I don't think it's impossible, actually.
So pretty broad, actually.
Yeah.
So I wondered if I could ask you about a certain bandwagon that people are jumping on in our era of capricious rulers. People point to any number of tyrants throughout history and make striking parallels to modern dictators. And I'm sure you could do that with Ashurbanipal, and I'm sure people have. Nothing riles him more than ingratitude. He's violent, he's vengeful, despite his claims to be magnanimous. I mean, ultimately, he kills the residents of a city because they don't ask him how he's feeling, right? So how useful are these comparisons to the past? Nobody's done that in our day and age, I don't think.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Well, he certainly doesn't hold back, I think. We've got the letters that he writes to these foreign rulers, and he doesn't mince his words. He tells them exactly what he thinks. Yeah, he does have temper tantrums with them, that's for sure. One of my favourite examples of this is when he's ranting to the Elamites' kingdom in Iran, where one of his enemies has fled and he's trying to extradite this man, and he's having a go at them saying, oh, why would I invade your country? There's nothing worth having in your country. If it had precious stones or gold and silver, maybe I would invade your country. If there's anything worth having there, maybe I would. But there isn't, so I'm not going to invade your country. Actually, he does go on to invade their country. But, he's very sarcastic, very contemptuous towards them.
And we can't necessarily believe what he says then.
Yeah. Quite.
He doesn't keep to his word.
Yeah.
I mean, you did also write, whenever we come across an aspect of Mesopotamian culture that seems bizarre, a closer look reveals that it reflects our own society and values, holding up a mirror to our own attempts at rationalisation and certainty. I mean, you sort of argued that with your examples of predicting elections, economic models, gathering the data, making models, predicting the future. We are all still doing that. So do you think, on balance, you can see more that is familiar than that is not?
I certainly can. That's because I've spent years trying to get into that mindset. But that's also something that it's important to me to try to communicate. The strangeness is one of the fascinating things about it. But when you look for these human elements, they're definitely there. And another way that we see that is in the letters between the king and his scholars, which is another whole aspect of this library that we haven't actually touched on yet. But there is an archive of correspondence that shows us how the scholars were using the text in the library, and it also preserves a lot of their own personal voices. So we've got academics complaining that they're not being paid enough. We've got doctors complaining that they're rushed off their feet and they desperately need a holiday because they're working around the clock, and when can they ever get a break? We've got exorcists who are incredibly busy and are writing these really apologetic replies for not having replied to the king's letter. Like, oh, sorry, I was too busy. I was here, there, everywhere. I left the writing board in my house. I haven't had a chance to consult it yet. So there's a lot of really human elements that come through that way as well.
I know, but we, as historians, we have been trained, haven't we, not to impress our own assumptions and interpretations onto the past too much. It's one of the great difficulties of doing history, of not taking our assumptions, because our assumptions, being assumptions, are unquestioned. It's quite hard to spot them. And this is why we have historical techniques to try and overcome our biases. So how do you balance, that need to respect a period or a part of the world or whatever it is we're looking at, to try and treat it on its own terms, to read the text in ways that they're telling us directly, but also not to ignore the underlying human motivations of the material?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely right. And of course, it's important to not project our own values and assumptions onto the past. But I think a lot of the time it goes too far. A lot of the time it really paralyzes people from really making these comparisons because we're so afraid of getting it wrong. So I think it's an overcorrection, really. And all we need to do is to just have a profound respect for the material and a deeper knowledge of it, really, I suppose, as well. And this is what I'm always telling my students. If you have an idea, then go and read the other text and see if it checks out. It's just about contextualizing it as best we possibly can. And I think we can and should do that.
Well, and there's a wider lesson, I think, isn't there? We're at this point in history where we've had a kind of jolt out of our complacency. So many people thought we'd reached a kind of liberal end of history, as famously defined by Francis Fukuyama. And you say, I quote, "There is a dangerous tendency for us in modern times to be a little too self-congratulatory, a little too in love with our own achievements, and to see people in the past as somehow lesser beings. We should not underestimate people who lived long ago. When we compare them to ourselves in any real detail, what actually emerges is their impressive intelligence. If we paid a bit more attention to our historical ancestors, do you think we could have avoided some of the pitfalls of the modern era?"
Oh, what a question. I think what's really important is really just to retain a sense of empathy. And that holds true both when we're studying the past and when we're studying people today. And people can often think very differently from us. And it's very easy for us to dismiss that and to think that we must be right. But this is one of the lessons we can learn from history, is that people who lived a long time ago and who do think so radically different from us can be understood if we just put in the effort to do so. And I think that's something that holds for how we behave today as well.
Selena Wisnom, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Selena Wisnom's book, The Library of Ancient Wisdom, is out now and available to buy online and at all good bookshops. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.